All right, ready to dive into some serious cellular signaling.
Always ready for a good deep dive.
Today we're taking on Class B GPCRs, specifically the secretin-like receptor family.
Oh, these guys are fascinating, especially when you think about how vital they are in things like endocrine and metabolic pathways. They're like the main point of contact for hormones like, glucagon.
Right. And we've got a mountain of research and studies to go through today, so what's our mission for this deep dive?
Well, it's kind of like creating a treasure map, right? But instead of gold, we're looking for a detailed understanding of these receptors.
I like that. So we're mapping them out, figuring out which hormones they bind to and how they impact things like metabolism and glycemic control.
Exactly. And it's not always easy, even with all the fancy tools we have now.
Like what?
Well, take X-ray crystallography, for instance. It's a powerful tool, but getting a clear picture of these Class B GPCR structures and how they interact with their ligands, it can be tricky.
Tricky how?
Well, it's like we're trying to solve a puzzle, but with half the pieces missing. We get glimpses, but the full picture is still elusive.
So that's where all this research comes in. We're
Right.
trying to piece together these complex interactions, one study at a time.
Exactly. And the studies use all sorts of cool techniques.
Like one paper I was reading mentioned time-resolved FRET, TR FRET. You ever use that?
Oh, yeah. TR-FRET's great. Really powerful, especially when you're trying to understand dynamic interactions. Seeing how molecules are moving and interacting in real time.
So we can actually see these interactions happen.
We can, and when you're dealing with something as complex as, GPCR signaling, that level of detail is super valuable.
It's like watching a microscopic ballet. All these tiny dancers interacting with each other.
I like that analogy.
And another study I came across actually went into the nitty-gritty of these receptors. They broke down specific amino acid sequences within the receptors, almost like a code that determines their function.
And that code is what lets these receptors bind to specific hormones. It's all about those subtle differences in structure.
It's like a cellular language, and each hormone has its own unique message.
Yeah, exactly. We see some familiar names popping up in the research, too. Glucagon, vasoactive intestinal peptide, VIP, parathyroid hormone.
So many important players. And these messages they carry, they trigger all sorts of events within the cell.
Oh, for sure. A whole cascade of events.
One source I was looking at said that cyclic AMP, CAMP, acts as a second messenger in these pathways. It's fascinating how this tiny molecule can set off such a huge chain reaction.
It really is. It's like a domino effect,
Yeah.
The hormone binds to the receptor, which activates a G protein inside the cell, and then that G protein kicks off a whole chain of events, often leading to the production of CAMP.
And the CAMP takes it from there.
Yeah, it acts like an internal messenger, basically, relaying instructions to different parts of the cell.
Amazing how even the smallest components of a cell can be so crucial in regulating our bodies.
Couldn't agree more. It's really beautiful when you think about it.
It is. Now, speaking of regulation, one article I found was talking about the calcium sensing receptor and its role in regulating calcium levels. It seems like this receptor could be a potential target for treating things like hyperparathyroidism.
Yeah, that's definitely an area that's getting a lot of attention right now. The idea that we can modulate the activity of these receptors, it opens up so many possibilities for treating all sorts of conditions, even certain types of cancer.
Wow. Of course, we're not giving any medical advice here.
Oh, of course not. Just exploring the potential based on what these studies are showing.
Right, right. Okay, so we've got these secretin-like receptors, super important, involved in all sorts of things.
They are.
And one of the things that caught my eye in the research was the connection to nociceptors,
Nociceptor.
the nerves that sense pain. One study highlighted the role of these receptors in regulating them. Pretty incredible, huh?
It is. I mean, think about it. If we can understand how these receptors modulate pain signals, we might be able to develop more effective pain relievers. Think about chronic pain.
Right. That would be a huge breakthrough. And it doesn't stop there. Another article I was reading dove into how these receptors affect neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin.
Ah, the key players in mood regulation.
Exactly. So it seems like these receptors could have implications for treating things like depression and anxiety.
It's amazing how interconnected everything is, isn't it?
It really is. One source even linked these receptors to Parkinson's disease.
Wow. Yeah, it's clear that these receptors have far-reaching effects, and understanding them better could lead to some pretty profound advances in treatment.
One thing I keep coming back to is the potential for developing highly targeted therapies drugs that act on specific receptors without all the side effects.
That's the holy grail, isn't it? To be able to target the problem with that level of precision?
It is. But as you said earlier, there's still a lot we don't know.
There is. Research is ongoing. We're still piecing together the puzzle, but it's a fascinating puzzle to solve.
Agreed. Okay, so let's dive into some specific examples. We've mentioned glucagon a couple of times. One receptor that keeps popping up is the GLP-1 receptor.
Oh, yeah, the GLP-1 receptor, that one's a biggie.
GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide 1.
That's it. It's a hormone that's released from your gut after you eat.
And the GLP-1 receptor, when activated, helps stimulate insulin release.
Right, essential for keeping your blood sugar levels stable.
Which is why these GLP-1 receptor agonists are gaining popularity as a treatment for type 2 diabetes, right?
Exactly. They mimic the action of GLP-1, helping the body do a better job of regulating those blood sugar levels.
Interesting. And there's another one, the GIP receptor.
GIP.
Yeah, gastric inhibitory polypeptide receptor.
Yeah.
It seems to play a similar role, working in tandem with GLP-1.
It does. And you know, this whole thing is a great example of what's called the incretin effect.
The incretin effect.
Yeah. It basically means that these hormones, GLP-1 and GIP, they amplify the release of insulin after a meal. It's like a built-in mechanism to make sure your body can handle that influx of glucose.
Like a finely tuned system of checks and balances.
Exactly.
Okay, ready to shift gears a bit and talk about another receptor.
Hit me with it.
How about the calcitonin receptor?
The calcitonin receptor, sure, that's an important one. The hormone calcitonin, which activates this receptor, is involved in regulating calcium and bone metabolism.
Oh, it's all about maintaining that balance to keep your bones strong and healthy.
Right. And there are already drugs out there, calcitonin receptor agonists, that are used to treat conditions like osteoporosis and Paget's disease. Both of those conditions are characterized by bone loss.
Makes sense. And speaking of bone health, let's not forget about the parathyroid hormone receptor.
Ah, yes, that one's key for regulating calcium levels in your blood. It controls the release of parathyroid hormone, kind of like a thermostat, keeping those levels in check.
So if something goes wrong with that receptor, things can get out of whack pretty quickly.
Oh, absolutely. Too much or too little parathyroid hormone can really throw things off. And that's why researchers are developing both agonists and antagonists of the parathyroid hormone receptor as potential treatments for bone diseases. Which one you'd use depends on the specific condition, of course.
Makes sense. Okay, before we get too deep into the therapeutic applications, maybe we should take a step back and talk about the structure of these secretin-like receptors. They're all part of Class B GPCRs, right?
Yep, that's right. They share a common blueprint.
So what does that blueprint look like?
Well, typically you have a large extracellular domain that acts as a docking station for the hormone. Then you have 7 transmembrane domains. These snake through the cell membrane like a bridge connecting the outside of the cell to the inside. And then finally, there's the intracellular domain where all the signaling magic happens.
Amazing how this one basic structure can lead to so many different functions.
It is, isn't it? And within that framework, there are subtle differences between the receptors. Those differences give each receptor its unique properties.
So what kind of differences are we talking about?
Well, for example, the amino acid sequence in that extracellular domain we talked about, that sequence determines which hormone the receptor will bind to.
So it's like a lock and key.
Exactly. Each hormone has a specific shape that fits perfectly into a particular receptor.
Got it. And what about the intracellular domain? What kind of differences do we see there?
Well, the sequence of the intracellular domain can influence which signaling pathways get activated. So it's not just about the hormone binding, it's also about what happens downstream inside the cell.
So different signaling pathways can lead to vastly different cellular responses.
Right. Think of it like a complex network of roads. Each one leads to a different destination.
I like that.
We've talked about the CAMP pathway, but there are other pathways that are important too. Some secretin-like receptors can activate the phospholyph C pathway, for example. That one leads to the production of second messengers like IP3 and DAY.
And those second messengers, they trigger their own cascade of events.
Exactly. They might release calcium from intracellular stores, for example. And ultimately, all of those events influence how the cell behaves.
It's a chain reaction.
What?
One event triggering the next.
A chain reaction. I like that.
Me too.
Now that we've covered some general principles, I'm curious, would you like to delve into some specific examples of how these receptors work in different contexts?
Absolutely. Let's pick up there in part 2.
So, ready to dive back into the world of secretin-like receptors?
Absolutely. I'm especially intrigued by how understanding these intricate signaling pathways could change how we treat diseases.
It's a game changer, for sure. And one of the sources here highlights a key tool in that process, high-throughput screening techniques. They're essential for drug discovery.
Yeah, I remember reading about those. It's like they're casting a wide net, seeing what they can catch.
Exactly. Scientists can test thousands, even millions of compounds quickly to find any that interact with a specific receptor.
It's finding a needle in a haystack. But once you've found that needle, that potential drug, how do you figure out what it actually does?
Well, you need to determine how it affects the receptor. Does it activate it, block it, or maybe change its signaling somehow? That's where functional assays come in.
Like those reporter gene assays I was reading about. They're kind of like cellular spies, right? Giving us a peek into what's happening inside the cell.
Exactly. If a compound activates a receptor, it might trigger the expression of a reporter gene. Scientists can easily detect that, and it tells them the compound is having a real effect.
Like a tiny beacon signaling what's going on. Pretty cool. What about those allosteric modulator? I saw those mentioned in one of the papers.
Allosteric modulators, yeah, those are interesting. They hold a lot of potential for drug development.
How so?
Well, they bind to a site on the receptor that's different from where the hormone binds, like a second set of controls.
Ah, I see. So instead of just turning the receptor on or off, you can fine-tune its activity.
Exactly. They can either enhance the receptor signaling, dampen it, or even change how it responds to its natural hormone.
That opens up a lot of possibilities. You could have drugs that are much more targeted with fewer side effects.
Precisely. It's a really exciting area of research.
Speaking of exciting research, let's get back to some specifics. We were talking about the GLP-1 receptor earlier and how it's a target for type 2 diabetes treatment.
Right. GLP-1 receptor agonists like exenatide and liraglutide are already being used to help people with type 2 diabetes manage their blood sugar.
And they work by mimicking GLP-1, the hormone that's released from the gut after you eat.
Exactly. And what's even more remarkable is that these drugs have other benefits. They can promote weight loss and reduce the risk of heart disease.
So it's like a multi-pronged attack on these interconnected health issues.
Exactly. And research is ongoing to develop even better GLP-1 receptor agonists and even combination therapies that might target multiple receptors involved in glucose regulation.
The potential's huge. Okay, ready for another receptor.
Ready when you are.
Let's talk about the calcitonin receptor. We touched on it briefly before, but I'd love to hear more about its role in bone health.
Sure. So as we mentioned, this receptor is involved in regulating calcium and bone metabolism, and it's a target for drugs that treat osteoporosis, like SAM and calcitonin.
Which mimics the action of calcitonin, helping to protect bones from breaking down. There was another receptor that caught my eye, though. The calcitonin gene-related peptide receptor, the CGRP receptor.
Ah, yes, that one. The CGRP receptor is involved in pain signaling, especially in migraines. In fact, CGRP receptor antagonists like aranumab and fremanezumab, they've been approved recently for migraine prevention.
That's amazing for those who suffer from migraines. It must make a huge difference.
It does. It's a great example of how understanding these receptors can lead to new treatments for all sorts of conditions.
And the research goes even further. One source mentioned the parathyroid hormone-related protein receptor, or PTHRP receptor, as a possible target for cancer treatment.
That's a fascinating area. You see, this receptor is overexpressed in certain cancers, like breast cancer and prostate cancer. And some studies suggest that blocking it could stop tumor growth and spread.
So PTHRP receptor antagonists could be a new weapon in the fight against cancer.
Potentially, yes. But it's still early days in the research.
Still, it's incredible to see how these receptors are popping up in so many different areas of medicine.
It really speaks to their widespread influence. Their potential as drug targets is enormous.
I'd love to know more about how these receptors play a role in the central nervous system.
Well, one we've already touched on is the corticotropin-releasing hormone receptor, the CRH receptor.
Right, we talked about that in the context of the stress response.
And as we discussed, when the CRH system is chronically activated, it can contribute to anxiety and depression. So it makes sense that scientists are looking at CRH receptor antagonists as possible treatments.
It really highlights the connection between physical and mental health.
Absolutely. Another interesting one in the central nervous system is the pituitary adenylate cyclase activating polypeptide receptor, the PTAP receptor.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is, but it's a fascinating receptor, involved in all sorts of things in the brain, like learning, memory, even neuroprotection.
So targeting this receptor could have implications for a range of neurological conditions.
Exactly. Researchers are looking at PCAP receptor agonists as potential therapies for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, for example.
It seems like the possibilities are endless.
It does feel that way sometimes. There's still so much we don't know.
So what's the key takeaway? What's the one thing people should understand about secretin-like receptors?
I think the most important thing is to remember that they are incredibly complex and multifaceted. They're not just simple on-off switches.
They're more like a language, with
Mm.
all sorts of nuances and variations depending on the receptor and the context.
A perfect analogy. And this complexity is both a challenge and an opportunity. It makes them difficult to study, but it also opens up a world of possibilities for drug development.
We can develop drugs that are much more specific and targeted.
Exactly. And don't forget, these receptors are involved in so many physiological processes, from blood sugar regulation to pain signaling to mood and behavior. They are crucial for maintaining balance, that homeostasis.
And when something goes wrong.
When they go awry, it can lead to all sorts of problems. Dysregulation of their signaling is implicated in a whole range of diseases.
That's why it's so important to understand them.
Exactly. So we can develop new and more effective treatments.
It sounds like we've only just scratched the surface.
We have. And that's what makes it so exciting. So much more to explore.
I'm ready to keep going. Let's see what else we uncover in part 3. Back again, ready to wrap up our deep dive into the secretin-like receptors.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? So many twists and turns.
Definitely. And one thing that really stands out to me is the incredible therapeutic potential we've uncovered.
Oh, absolutely. It seems like almost every condition we can think of is somehow linked to these receptors.
Right. Diabetes, obesity, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, anxiety, depression, you name it. It makes you wonder if we could just pinpoint the exact receptor that's causing the problem, we could develop a drug to tackle it head on.
That's the idea, isn't it? Instead of just managing symptoms, we could actually aim for a cure.
That would be incredible. But I know there's still so much we don't know.
There is. Every answer seems to lead to 10 more questions. But that's what makes research so exciting, right? It's a constant process of discovery.
One thing that for sure, though, there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to targeting these receptors.
No way. Each receptor has its own unique role to play, its own set of signaling pathways. And those pathways can be incredibly complex.
So I guess what you're saying is developing effective therapies is going to require a deep understanding of all these subtle differences.
Exactly. And that's where techniques like homology modeling and molecular dynamics simulations become so important.
Homology modeling, molecular dynamics, those sound pretty complicated.
They can be, but basically they allow us to study these receptors in a virtual environment, kind of like having a microscopic lab inside a computer.
So you can actually see how a drug interacts with the receptor.
We can. And by understanding those interactions, we can actually start to optimize drug structures to make them more effective and reduce side effects.
That's incredible. It's like we're able to manipulate these tiny molecules with pinpoint accuracy.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it? And it's revolutionizing the way we think about drug discovery, giving us real hope for treating these diseases in a whole new way.
I can see that. You know, for most of this deep dive, we've been talking about receptors as if they're these static things. But are they really?
Ah, good point. They're anything but static. These receptors are dynamic, adaptable, and their signaling can be influenced by all sorts of factors.
Like what?
Oh, everything. Environmental cues, genetic predispositions, the list goes on and on.
So our genes and our environment actually play a role in how these receptors function.
They do.
Yeah.
Which makes things even more complicated, of course. But it also suggests that we might be able to personalize treatments.
Personalized.
Yeah, therapies that are tailored to an individual's specific genetic makeup and their environmental exposures.
Wow. It's like we're stepping into the age of personalized medicine.
We are, and it's incredibly exciting. So many possibilities.
Well, I have to say, after this deep dive, I'm feeling incredibly optimistic about the future of this whole field.
Me too. There's still so much to learn, but we're making progress every day.
And who knows what amazing discoveries are just around the corner. So to all our listeners out there, keep asking questions, keep exploring. The world of G protein-coupled receptors is vast and fascinating. It's the key to understanding human health and disease, and the possibilities are truly limitless.